Register, and we are here today with Julián Castro. He is a Democratic candidate for president. Mr. Castro was the former Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and also the former mayor of San Antonio, Texas. So welcome, Secretary Castro.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's introduce the Register staff in the room here, starting with Carol.
Carol Hunter, Executive Editor.
Rox Laird, member of the editorial board.
Richard Doak, member of the editorial board.
Rachel Stassenberger, Politics Editor.
Robin Upsall, Political Reporter.
Brianne Fahnensteel, Chief Politics Reporter.
Rika Basu, Opinion Columnist.
Okay, all right. Well, Secretary Castro, why don't you start by telling us why you think you're the best candidate that Democrats can nominate for president?
Yeah, and thank you very much, Kathy, for having me. Thank you to everybody here at the Register editorial board and for the folks, hopefully they're watching. I think that in this election that voters are looking for three things. I think they're looking for somebody with the right experience to be president. They're looking for somebody with the right vision for the future of our country. Of course, Democrats are looking for somebody who can beat Donald Trump. And I'm sure that y'all hear out there, that's probably the thing that you hear the most, right? Somebody who is electable and can actually make sure that we beat Donald Trump. Fundamentally, I'm running for president because I feel tremendously blessed with the opportunity that I've had in life. To grow up in a single-parent household in San Antonio with a grandmother who was an immigrant from Mexico and worked as a maid, a cook, and a babysitter, raised my mom as a single parent. My mother raised my brother Joaquin and me as a single parent. We were able to go to the public schools of San Antonio and then become the first in our family to be professionals as attorneys and then go into public service and serve our country, me and the president's cabinet and he and Congress. And I want to make sure that that kind of opportunity is there for everybody in the 21st century and be the kind of president that can deliver that kind of opportunity in this century for what it takes for families to prosper now. I have the right experience, having served as the mayor of the 7th largest city in the United States in San Antonio for 5 years and in the president's cabinet as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. I believe I have a strong, compelling vision for the future of the country. I've talked during the course of this campaign about how we can make our country smarter, healthier, fairer, and more prosperous for everybody so that everyone counts and everyone can prosper in the years ahead. I've talked about making sure that we go from a president who sees himself as the president for 37% of this country that he considers his base to a president for all Americans. From one who has demonstrated a lack of integrity and decency in office to a president who can demonstrate those things in the Oval Office. From a president that is the most divisive president we probably have ever had to a president that can bring our country together. And from a president that wants us to go backward and make us something again to a president that wants to take us forward. Finally, I can beat Donald Trump. We lost Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by less than 80,000 votes collectively. I'm confident that I can go back and get those votes and that we can win in the Midwest. I'm confident that we can come into states like Iowa and also Ohio that we lost by 8 or 9 points and get these states back, and that I'm the Democratic Party's best hope to go and get the 29 electoral votes of Florida, the 11 electoral votes of Arizona, which is going to be very competitive this year, and even the 38 electoral votes of my home state of Texas, which also is going to be very competitive in 2020.
I like to say that we don't care about polls. We care more about what a candidate is going to do if elected. But people don't want to throw their vote away on somebody that they don't think can win. Explain how you get through Iowa. You're still kind of midway down in the polls. How do you convince Iowans to launch you out of here in a way that you need to win in the other early states and get to the nomination?
Well, as you know, we have about 3.5 months until the Iowa caucus, and these days, 3.5 days is a political lifetime, much less 3.5 months. So we're working hard here. We've expanded our team about a month ago here. We're organizing in different parts of the state. My visits to the state are becoming more frequent. I'm going to be spending a lot of time out here in Iowa and also these other early states. And what I've seen is that when I get in front of crowds, when I get in front of folks, that people do respond and that I can gain traction. I'm going to work hard to win the Iowa caucus. I also know, though, that a lot of this is about beating expectations. And, when we look at what's happened in these early states, whether it's Iowa or New Hampshire, as much of the story has been written by folks not only that necessarily won, but also people who have beaten expectations, whether here in Iowa or New Hampshire and so forth. And that's what we're working toward. And so I believe that I can beat expectations in Iowa and get stronger and go on in New Hampshire and Nevada and do well.
You talked about restoring the dignity of the office of president. How specifically do you do that? What are your strategies when 37% of the country is not going to believe anything you say and won't like anything that you do?
I think we had a great model of that in Barack Obama. Even though you had a Washington where Mitch McConnell was saying that he wanted to make him a one-term president, obviously a very polarized Washington, what you had in Barack Obama was a president who upheld the highest ethical standards in office. I was very proud to serve in his administration. I think whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, that he's somebody that we can look at as a president that didn't have any scandals, that conducted himself well and expected that from the rest of his administration. That's the kind of administration that I would like to have, that I would aim for. And we certainly begin, it's a very low bar coming after Donald Trump, but we certainly begin by ensuring that we follow the rule of law, unlike this president has, that we not appoint coal lobbyists to head up the EPA, that we not have family members that are engaged in making policy, not use personal lawyers like Rudy Giuliani to create a shadow foreign policy. The bar is very low. I would like to aim actually for somebody who set the bar very high, which is Barack Obama, and I would model my administration after what he was able to do and we were able to do in that administration.
One thing Donald Trump has perhaps done very well is expose how weak and toothless the ethics laws are and ethics policies are governing the White House. Do you think that any of those should be strengthened? Would you be looking to put more teeth in to enforce some of those ethics laws? With the self-dealing and the politicking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we need to give more authority to the enforcement agency on those ethics laws in terms of the executive branch. We also need to create more transparency within the executive branch and also in Congress. I support, for instance, making the Freedom of Information Act applicable to Congress and expanding it within the executive branch. And so strengthening the ethics laws and also creating more transparency so that Americans can demand more accountability and the press can demand more accountability, I think will help lead over time to more consistently ethical governance out of the administration.
Would you apply those ethical guidelines or requirements to members of the president's or vice president's family as well?
Yeah, sure, of course, yeah. Yeah, I know this question has been asked recently with regard to Vice President Biden. Let me just say, I believe that Vice President Biden is honorable, that he's honest, and I believe that he would conduct himself and his administration, if he were elected president, in an honest and honorable way as well. For myself, I would say that my track record is one of trying to strengthen the ethics code where I've been when I was city councilman, when I was mayor. I did a strengthening of our ethics code. I also introduced for the first time ever campaign finance reform in San Antonio. I worked at HUD to make sure that we followed all ethical guidelines, and I haven't been afraid to admit when I made a mistake with the Hatch Act in 2016. When I inadvertently suggested that Hillary Clinton should be the nominee while I was talking about HUD business. And they brought that to my attention, and I said, you know what, that was a mistake. And we made sure that we didn't make that mistake again. Again, this administration, the Trump administration, has set a very low bar. That's not the bar that we should use. We should use the bar that Obama set and then try and take it even higher for the rest of the administration.
As you well know, Republicans do not say that Obama necessarily set a high bar, and they further say it's part of what divided our nation. They talk about Fast and Furious, they talk about Benghazi, they talk about emails, they talk about IRS audits of nonprofits and things like that. So do you dismiss what Republicans see as scandals under the Obama administration?
Well, I mean, the thing is that those things were investigated, whether it's that or Hillary Clinton's emails or anything else, and nothing came of those investigations. There wasn't any substance there. And so when you compare apples to apples, something like what Mueller produced versus the investigations into these other issues, I mean, I do dismiss a lot of their allegations because they were investigated and nothing was found. And they were investigated at a time when Republicans had control of the House of Representatives. So it was their own investigations. You know, I believe this ties into the fact that you have a right-wing media ecosystem that invents scandals and blows these things up well beyond the truth behind them, the facts behind them. Benghazi, a very good example of that, and a number of the ones that you mentioned are. I'm not saying that there's never been, you know, anything with any substance, but what you have today consistently, whether it's with Fox News or this other parts of the right-wing media ecosystem, is that they create scandals where there is none.
Do you think there's any way that you could reach out to that 38% of the electorate that are diehard Donald Trump supporters for whatever reason, but a lot of them have good reasons for feeling grievances and left out and what have you. How do you reach out to those folks?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I mean, you know, I came up through local politics, and when I was running for city council, when I was running for mayor, we were in a nonpartisan system. And so, you know, I'll just give you a practical example of this. When I was out block walking or we were phone banking, you know, I wasn't just talking to Democrats. I was also block walking and talking to Republicans. You know, it didn't matter whether they were Republican or Democrat. They got on our list because we had to run with no party label. And I actually enjoyed working in an environment where people did not have to toe a party line. And on the council itself, we had to work with, you know, it was mostly Democrat, but we had to work with some Republicans, and I was able to do that. I also was able to reach out to folks to get one of my signature accomplishments done in San Antonio, which was Pre-K for SA, a ballot initiative to significantly expand high-quality full-day pre-K by raising the sales tax by 1/8 of a cent. That required talking to people that didn't like taxes, that were conservative in the business community and in the general community, and we were able to get that passed. I also think that there are things that we can do in Washington, D.C. to tamp down some of the polarization. And I'm thinking specifically of taking a page from Iowa and doing independent or bipartisan or neutral or commission style redistricting. As you know, we have about 15 states right now that already do that. And in the House and H.R. 1, there's legislation that would help create that for all states. I believe that should be done in all 50 states so that you don't have these politicians choosing their people, right? In the long term, I also think finding a way to get past Citizens United and get a lot of the big money out of politics so that people aren't, you know, just going by these big interests that are going to fund their campaigns or fund a PAC that is going to fund with IE, independent expenditures, a campaign. And then just for myself, you know, during this campaign, we've tried to be as inclusive as possible. You know, there was a conversation about whether to go on Fox News for a town hall, and I did that because I recognize that there's some people watching that may legitimately be open to voting for a Democrat, and I wanted the opportunity to make my case to them. And so I'll continue in every way that I can, you know, without compromising what I believe, but being willing to negotiate and compromise on actual policy. I'll continue to reach out to folks.
Before we move on from this, I'm glad you mentioned FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. Frankly, the Obama administration was seen as being really terrible at complying with Freedom of Information Act requests, that they were delayed, well beyond the deadlines. I mean, how was HUD under you? How fast did you respond to Freedom of Information Act requests, and would you, as president, make sure that those deadlines are respected?
Yeah, I would work as hard as we can to make sure that the deadlines are respected. Yeah, I certainly don't recall we had thousands of requests, right? I have no doubt that there are some reporters that will say that they had a challenge getting information, whether it was from HUD or other departments, but each time that I've been in office, whether at the local level or the federal level, we've tried to make sure that we're responsive. And that's the spirit that I would bring as president, and more importantly, that we would deliver to all of the appointees and the administration. I also think, that there is a big difference between Obama and Trump and how they handle these things. Trump has made news media the enemy, quite literally, and I think that we need to go back to an administration that gives press briefings, that doesn't see the press as an enemy, and also that makes sure that we respect the Freedom of Information Act and other laws to get information to the press.
Would you tweet?
Yeah, I think we're going to use that. Yeah, I would tweet, but I certainly wouldn't do it the way that this president does it. Yeah, I think.
But would you use Twitter as a way to just go straight to the people in the way that Donald Trump has? However you.
I think so. Yeah. I think that pretty much we're not going back on that. Yeah, I agree with that part of it. I agree with that. It offers the opportunity in an unfiltered way to be able to convey a message and your perspective. And historically, presidents had fireside chats that were covered, or there was a time when more of the president's actions or speeches were covered more religiously by the news media live, for instance, and unfiltered. And I just see this in some ways, ironically, as kind of going backward to offer a more unfiltered avenue for communication. The difference is that right now, that's in the hands of a president who uses it very irresponsibly to threaten nuclear war, to insult people. Thankfully today, with the passing of Representative Cummings, he was very decent and said nice things about Representative Cummings. But I'm going to use that in a responsible way, but in a way that does communicate directly with the people.
But you wouldn't short press conferences.
No, from day one, we would restore the practice of doing press briefings in the briefing room, at the State Department, the White House, all of the other agencies that normally do those. There was a time when I wanted to be a journalist. I went to Stanford and I began majoring in communications, and I double majored in communications and political science. I have a very deep respect for journalism. I see how important its role is in our society, and one of the things that makes us special as a country, and it's a shame what this president has done, trying to make the news media the enemy. Obviously, like every other politician, there are things that I don't like that are printed. There's a critique that I have of the news media, both in this campaign and also just generally, but I agree with those who say that you absolutely need the press to make our democracy stronger and better.
I'd like to hear you air that critique of the press.
Which part of it?
You said there's a critique that I have of the media and the way this campaign is covered. What is it?
Well, I'll give you an example from the other day, right? I said on the debate stage, I've been trying to challenge CNN and the New York Times to ask a question about housing, even if they didn't ask it of me. In some ways that's unfair because I was the housing secretary. But what y'all must see in Des Moines and what they see throughout this state and throughout the country is that there's a rental affordability crisis. More people are sleeping on the streets, more people are homeless, but even people who aren't homeless, more people are paying 40, 50, 60% of their income in rent. And this is one of those issues that just never gets attention on the debate stage, even though a lot of families, middle-class families, lower middle class, working poor people, are dealing with it. So I said, look, why don't y'all ask about it? And my critique of this was that they're different media values, but two of the media values that seem to drive a lot of what's asked on those debate stage are, number one, conflict. You'll notice, especially the way CNN does this, that they pose the questions, Secretary Castro, you said that blah, 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 and then they ask the person to respond or they ask you about it. and or issues where people have contrasted with each other. That's one conflict. The other one is timeliness, something that's happened within the last 14 days, whether it's the Ukraine situation or Ukraine call or other things. And what gets left out of that in the shuffle are issues that are bread and butter issues, but that are not the most glamorous or, so to speak, sexy issues, but that impact people tremendously. The effect of that is that the media cover only certain issues but never delve into, with the politicians that want this job, some of the most important issues in the most high-profile opportunities like the debate stage.
So what is your housing policy?
And by the way, I'll show you. It's actually on our list here.
No, good, yeah.
We were going to get to
Yes.
it.
I just wish it was on the list for CNN and the New York Times. Yeah, no, I mean, we do it here in the small setting, but when you have, the big setting, it never comes up. We released a housing plan that has several goals. Number one, to create 3 million more units of affordable housing in the next 10 years. That calls for investing billions of dollars to create that housing, investing in the National Housing Trust Fund, expanding the low-income housing tax credit, also investing in more traditional tools like community development block grants and home funding. It has a goal of ending homelessness in our country by 2028, which sounds very ambitious, and that is ambitious, but during the Obama administration, from 2010 to 2016, we reduced veteran homelessness by 47% because Washington actually worked the way that it should. Congress appropriated the resources for housing vouchers for veterans that needed them. Local communities adopted best practices for getting homeless people into housing, and there was a coordinated effort among the agencies of the federal government, from the VA to HUD to every 17 other federal agencies, to do this work. So I believe that we can be ambitious there and make sure that more people have a safe, decent, affordable place to live.
Your plan deals both with home ownership and rent subsidy, does it not? Which of those do you think should be the higher priority, though, and where should the most investment go?
Well, I mean, right now in our system, most of the investment actually goes to home ownership, right? And you need both of those things. When I became HUD secretary, one of the things I said was I believed that we needed to end the stigma of promoting home ownership. After we went through the housing crisis in 07, 08, 09, 2010, a narrative developed that the big cause of that was that people got home loans that shouldn't have gotten them. And there were some people that got these loans that they should not have had, but that was also driven by these big banks and financial players that had an incentive for that to happen. So I said, as long as we can learn the lessons of the past and keep regulations in place that keep that from happening again, I think that it is a good thing for people to be able to own a home. At the same time, the most pressing need is that we need to do something about the fact that the rents are going through the roof. And so one of the things I've called for in my housing plan is a refundable renter's tax credit to give renters more assistance to be able to afford a place to live, even as we increase the supply of rental housing.
Does that add to a market force, though, that just makes rents go even higher?
Well, I think
if you give subsidies.
I think that's one of the reasons you also need to build more units. I also believe that there is a role for quality, well-done public housing. I actually think that we need to look at the public housing model again, because if you invest in public housing and you keep it up, it actually allows you better control of those assets and the ability to shelter that from a skyrocketing cost of rent in a market, in the private market. We have had some mistakes we made in the past in how we did public housing, and we have something like, over $25 billion of repair needs in public housing right now. So we're way behind, but as we work ourselves into investing again more in housing opportunity, I think public housing actually is one of the smartest things that we can do if it's well done.
Can you talk a little bit about the which the Obama administration was not able to fix, although you certainly worked on.
Yeah,
So
I
how
mean,
would you, for the long term, you build the house, you've got to take care of it for 50 years.
we fell behind in the country. We backed off of the commitment that we used to have of making the investment not only in creating new units, but also in being able to maintain those units. And so, I mean, you're absolutely right that if you're going to build it, you have to allocate the resources to actually maintain it, and we have not done that. And NYCHA in New York is the best example of that. But nationally, the number that I remember is that we lose 10,000 units of public housing to disrepair every year out of about 1.1 million units. So it's significant.
And so you're proposing building more public housing and rejuvenating that program.
And maintaining and allocating the resources to
But let's
maintain
say
it.
you're president for 8 years, what happens on year 9? Because that is a multi-year commitment, multi-agency commitment, multi-president commitment. How would you make sure that that is a long-term investment?
Well, I mean, I think it's true that anytime the president changes or Congress turns over, that you're going to have a susceptibility to falling back in those investments. The best thing that we can do is put in place a program that is working well. One of the other pushes that I made when I was HUD secretary and that I would make as president is I want to make sure the programs that we have in place are actually working. I favor measuring the results of these programs, and that things that are working well, we should at least keep funding or do more of, and things that are not working well should not be funded, or we should figure out a way to fix them. Because I've said very clearly that whether you're very liberal or you're very conservative, you have to operationalize things. You have to make sure that things work, and that if people are putting $1 into something, that you're getting that dollar's worth of value. And that's the best. I always used to say that's the best thing that we can do to make sure that there's support in the future for making those investments. That's what I would do.
Before we move on from this issue, I want to get your take on a very local question here. The Des Moines City Council is debating its housing zoning laws, and one of the arguments is, should we require larger footprints for new houses in this city because they will grow more in equity than perhaps smaller houses where people might be able to afford to get into them, but their property value is not going to grow. Where do you come down on that?
I met with the mayor on this issue, I guess about 6 weeks ago, and I've expressed an opinion on it. I understand the city council recently passed, approved of it, or took the first, did maybe the first hearing or took the first pass at it. My approach was, or my view is, that they need to be very careful about that, because I think what they're setting in place may make the housing market here less affordable. And I understand fully, in some ways, Des Moines reflects the situation that we had in San Antonio a decade ago or more, where people don't feel like there's as much of a challenge with affordable housing as you might have in Chicago or Minneapolis or somewhere else. But I know that you're already behind in terms of the number of affordable units, and if they don't do this right, this stands to accelerate that gap, to make it harder for someone to be able to actually rent a home or to buy a home in Des Moines, and it may have these unintended consequences. And so I
Did you give the mayor any advice?
Well, I mean, our conversation was fairly brief, but I did say, he and I did talk about that point. I did make that point in terms of housing affordability. And I hope that if they do pass an ordinance, they come up with an ordinance that is going to allow enough flexibility for builders to build homes that people can afford, and they don't price a whole bunch of people out of this market.
Okay. Just moving on, I wanted to ask you about decriminalizing illegal border crossings. You've talked about that in national debates. It would still be a civil offense, from what I understand, just not a criminal offense. Explain that to us as you would explain to a voter who is worried that our national security will be compromised if we can't control our borders?
I'd say that under my immigration plan, crossing the border without permission would still be against the law and be enforceable against someone who crosses the border without permission. But it would be enforced as a civil matter instead of a criminal matter. The way that it used to be enforced for a long time, in 1929, Congress passed Section 1325 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. It was authored by a segregationist senator, Senator Blease, who openly advocated lynching. And his law was basically ignored for 60 years, was not enforced for almost 60 years. We treated these things, we enforced accountability through our civil system, not as a criminal offense, through Republicans and Democrats. And then after 9/11, the government started to ramp up the number of times that it used that particular law, which makes it a misdemeanor if you cross the border without permission. So now it's a criminal offense. The federal government started to use that, and when Trump came in, he weaponized it. He weaponized that law to start separating migrant parents from their kids. My point has been that we can have accountability in the system, we can have a secure border, but we don't need that law in place so that a future administration can weaponize it against parents and kids the way that Trump has. And I don't trust that some future administration won't weaponize it again. I would also say, we have 654 miles of fencing, we have thousands of personnel at the border, we have drones, we have planes, helicopters, we have security cameras. There's a lot that goes into securing the border that is gonna make sure that we have a hold on what's going on at the border. And a lot of these people, most of these people that are coming to the border now, they're actually presenting themselves to our Border Patrol agents, right? They're not trying to escape. They actually are asking for asylum. So we know what's happening at the border.
On that note, to what extent do you think that Trump voters were driven by anti-immigrant sentiment and also racism and the whole build that wall narrative that he drummed up? And how would you be able to win those voters over?
Well, I have no doubt that people had different reasons for supporting Trump. Some for economic reasons, some because there's a certain percentage of people that they want to shake things up. They don't like the way that Washington's working, and Trump was their ultimate expression of shaking things up. And then some that may have, a darker reason, whether it's against immigrants or other folks, who responded to the scapegoating and the otherizing of these immigrants. What I would say to them is that, my grandmother came here as an immigrant when she was 7 years old as an orphan. And, she worked hard like people from different countries over the generations, whether they've been from Ireland or from Italy or, any number of places over the years. This is nothing new. There was a time when Germans were spoken of as that they were going to defile America and bring us down as a country. There was a Chinese Exclusion Act. There was a time when Irish were discriminated against and people wanted them to go back home. And so I would challenge them to understand that each of those waves of immigrants, both documented and undocumented, have made this country stronger. And if they could understand the community, and I'm sure they see it here in Iowa, I see it in places like Storm Lake and Marshalltown and others, where folks are entrepreneurial, they're creating jobs for people, they are oftentimes people of faith. I was in Matamoros, Mexico about 2 weeks ago, visiting with people who are caught up in the Remain in Mexico policy, waiting over there on the other side of the border for their asylum case to be adjudicated. They're telling me that they're praying to God, they're praying to Jesus, that He will help them and they'll be able to come to the United States. I mean, I'd ask the people who believe in Jesus and God on this side of the border to recognize that people who believe in Jesus and God on the other side of the border and have a lot of the same values are just looking for a better life. I understand we need a policy on immigration that creates an orderly system. You know, we're not going to have a system without enforcement. We're not going to have a system where just anybody can do anything. My plan creates an orderly system with border security, but it treats people with common sense. It brings more reason and more order to that system, and it treats people with compassion instead of cruelty.
In the debate the other night, you said you would be willing to try a pilot project for universal basic income. That seems like kind of an expensive experiment. Is that the kind of thing that you would be willing to go into, not knowing for sure how it would work?
Well, I mean, that's why it would be a pilot, right? There are some who have proposed that we go, you know, immediately with universal basic income. That is something that is new to the United States in the form that it's been proposed. And you know, my main point has been, I understand that we're in a time of an economy that is transitioning, and that we have to be creative and we have to be open-minded about the approaches that we take to make sure that everybody is going to be able to prosper in the years ahead. And so if the question is, look, are you open to looking at how universal basic income might work in the United States? Sure, but I don't agree with, you know, passing nationwide UBI tomorrow. I would rather see that piloted in a thoughtful way in our country and understand whether that can work in our system. A lot of the things that were said on the stage make sense to me. I believe in the dignity of work and having a job and what that means to people. I believe that most people, if you give them a choice between collecting a paycheck of $1,000 a month or working and having something that they're doing, as long as they're getting, I believe that if they're getting a good wage that reflects the value of their work, then I think most people would choose that. And the question becomes, what do we do with gaps that exist there? And so, you know, I'd be willing to pilot it, but we'd have to see how that works first.
President Trump has made a lot of the strength of the economy based on a variety of different metrics, like the stock market, like the unemployment rate. Do you agree with those measurements of economic health? How do you measure the economy's health? And overall, where would you see the most important priorities for keeping the economy growing?
Of course, those are some of the measurements that we should look at. I do think that in some ways, some of them have more limited value today than they did before. For instance, because of the income inequality in our country, somebody can be employed. There are people that are employed, right? But wages have not kept up with the cost of housing or the cost of many other things. And so even though somebody has a job today, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person or that family is doing okay. There are a lot of people that are employed that are not doing okay because their wages just don't support their ability to pay the rent, or their ability to pay the rent and do other things that they need to do. Childcare, you know, food, medicine, all of the things that people need. So we also need to look at broader analysis of how well people are doing in general, you know, when it comes to being able to afford the rent, afford health care, and so on.
And when you look at the current economy with those measures in mind, how do you think the economy is doing?
I believe there are a lot of people out there that are hurting, that are doubling up with relatives because they don't have their own place to stay. I was in Oakland a couple of months ago, and I went to a school and they told me about a teacher that is sleeping in her car. I was in Oakland about a month ago, and I visited this homeless encampment that had 75 people living in makeshift shacks and tents. I see homelessness increasing throughout our country. Medical debt is one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest reasons for bankruptcy among American families. So, you know, there's a story underneath that big story that the president is trying to tell about our economy, and you know, part of what we need to do is to have a vision for the future of a country that makes sure that everybody can prosper. That's what I've proposed, whether it's through instituting changes to our tax code that will allow for affordable universal child care, or a health care system that actually covers people that need it and does it in an affordable way, or addressing any number of other issues like housing.
How do you address wages? You mentioned that is one of the problems, and I think that a lot of people have seen that in our state. We have a lot of people who are working, but may be working at a minimum wage that's $7.25 an hour. So how do you address wages?
I think you do that in a number of important ways. Number one, by requiring a higher minimum wage. We have not raised the minimum wage in 10 years in this country, the federal minimum wage. I believe we should raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and then index it with automatic increases to it, so that we don't have to fight every year and then maybe get an increase once every 15 years to the minimum wage in the future. That we need to invest in the ability of labor to organize effectively, so that in the private sector and also in the public sector, but especially in that private sector, you have stronger unions that are able to bargain, hopefully, for better wages and for better benefits. Even as more companies are treating people like independent contractors, classifying them that way, or reducing their hours to less than 30 hours, and they're being classified as part-time workers. Obviously, a lot of companies don't offer the same kind of pension or even 401k benefits that they used to. And I think part of the answer is stronger labor organizing in this country. It's also important that we create a 21st century safety net. That's what I've argued for, and others have too. I mean, with universal child care, with housing that's affordable, with universal health care, with tuition-free public state universities, community colleges, and so forth.
What about the sort of investment model of corporations, where corporations tend to operate for the shareholders, to put a not too fine point on it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the critique of, on several fronts, ensuring that corporations don't only make decisions based on the next quarter and or based on the interests strictly of their shareholders, even though that is wrapped up in their fiduciary responsibility as well, right? Some have suggested, for instance, making sure that we have employee interests represented on corporate boards. I agree with that. I also agree with raising the corporate tax rate back up. I really don't believe that most corporations make a decision about their presence in the United States or their investment in the United States solely based on the corporate tax rate, because there's so many other things about the United States that provide a benefit versus investing in other countries, from our legal system to the quality of our employees to the quality of life in general.
You don't think a higher corporate tax rate would encourage companies to move overseas or move operations overseas?
I mean, perhaps at the margins, but I don't think that I believe we would get more out of that positively than we would lose.
There's been some talk about what to do about the U.S. Supreme Court, and some candidates have said add seats to the Supreme Court to allow for more of a philosophical balance. I don't believe you're one who says
No.
so. What do you do with the Supreme Court that might address that concern about philosophical balance but doesn't make it worse?
I mean, I'm against packing the court, because what'll happen, and this argument was also made on the stage the other night, is that if you put 3 more people on there, or however many we put on there, then you're going to have, the next time the other side controls things, they may try and pack it. There are other proposals. I think one of the proposals was a system where you have 15 justices, for instance, and 10 of them decide on 5 of them. To me, if there's one change to the Supreme Court that I'd be willing to consider, it would be term limits, so that you have a replenishment of leadership and thought and ideas on both sides that is fairly applied, perhaps 20 years, perhaps 15 years. There are different ways that it could be done, but I think that makes sense. I don't think there's anything sacrosanct about a lifetime appointment, especially because when you make
It
a...
is in the Constitution.
Well,
You'd have to get that changed.
sure, yeah, but if we're talking about ways to improve the court, right?
So talk about the kind of people you would want to appoint, not only to the Supreme Court, but to the federal courts in general.
Well, I mean, number one, we need to do some cleaning up in terms of revamping the way that appointments are vetted, in the public sphere to begin with. This president made a mistake when he booted the ABA, for instance, from the process of vetting these folks. And in part because he's grossly ignored organizations like that. You have some people out there, these people being appointed to federal judgeships that never tried any kind of case, never showed up to court, or they did it once. It strains common sense. So the number one thing that we need to do is, apart from any ideological direction, is that we need to restore professional input into the vetting process, right? And then secondly, I would appoint people who have demonstrated integrity first and foremost in their service. And then third, of course, I would appoint people whose values, progressive values, are consistent with mine, and look for people who have demonstrated that in their rulings and throughout their time in the legal profession and so forth. And also, welcome input from the senators who represent those states.
President Carter had a commission which he appointed to provide to him names of judicial nominees so that he could get more women and minorities on the bench. And during his administration, that happened. Not on the Supreme Court, I don't think he had any appointments, but throughout the federal courts. That's been done away with, and during the Trump administration, I think the overwhelming numbers are white males. Would you consider something like what Carter did to get more women and minorities on the courts?
Yeah, I'm open to that. I applaud the Obama administration for the level of diversity in their judicial appointments, and I think we can build off of that, whether it's with a formal process, or obviously they were able to do it perhaps in a different way, but effectively. Doing it in a formal way, I think, would send a strong signal, not only to the rest of the government, but importantly to corporate America. We see in some sectors, like this tech sector, how terrible their hiring is for women and for people of color. And so I do think that there's value in formally doing those kinds of things. At the end of the day, what I'm concerned with is the result. You want very qualified people. You can't sacrifice quality. The thing is, though, we have a lot of women and people of color out there who are very qualified and who could serve in these roles. Unfortunately, this administration just is not, although I will give them that there aren't as many that are on the conservative side of things, thankfully. Yeah.
President Trump released a list of names of people that he would consider for the Supreme Court. There are now some progressive groups asking Democratic candidates to do the same thing. Is that something that you would do?
I hadn't been asked that before. I'd have to think about it. I don't know. I think there's value in doing that, in the sense of giving people concrete examples. In another way, it may put the people that you put on that list in maybe unwelcome circumstances with their own employers, or whatever their situation is. And I think Trump, as far as I know, at least in the modern era, Trump was the first person to do this. The reason I would be open to it is that I do think that it gives people a very, very specific, concrete sense of the kind of people that you would appoint.
So who do you who do you like that's either on the court now or has been on the court? Sort of, who's your judicial hero, if there are any?
I mean, I think there are a number of people on the court. You know, I think that obviously Justice Ginsburg, Justice Sotomayor are doing a fantastic job. I'm disappointed with the direction of the court. My hope is that as he continues in his service, that Justice Roberts will side more with the four more, progressive justices. He has shown the ability to do that in some ways. In a lot of other ways, he's been, a very traditional conservative justice. But my hope is, for instance, when these questions come up, and they probably will reach the Supreme Court about the ability to get documents from the administration that are going to be necessary in the impeachment inquiry, probably, that they will do the right thing. I think a lot of people still feel that the Bush versus Gore Supreme Court case was politically decided, including by people like Justice Scalia, that had shown a different sensitivity from their jurisprudence, his jurisprudence in that case. So, I think that people like Sotomayor and Ginsburg have been doing a great job.
Do you believe in executive privilege? That concept is not in the Constitution.
Sure. I believe in executive privilege, but not abusing it.
Yeah, where do you draw the line?
Well, I mean, I would be lying to you if I said that I'm an expert right now on the bounds of executive privilege, but, there has been carved out a privilege afforded to the president and to his administration, or in the future, her administration, that I believe that we can draw that line in a way that respects the oversight function of Congress and also understands that there's going to be judicial review too. What I hope we don't get into, and we're going to see this soon, is the president amping up his talk to undermine even the credibility and standing of the judicial branch as well as the legislative branch. Once you start hearing that, and maybe he's done a little bit of it, but if he starts doing that in full, that at this point, I think we've already crossed the bridge into a constitutional crisis. But this is somebody, if he does that, that really is acting like a dictator.
Would you pledge to never defy a congressional subpoena for documents or testimony?
I would pledge to work with Congress to be responsive to congressional subpoenas. I say that because I don't believe that the subpoena that's been given to the Trump administration, or subpoenas, are anything but valid. Those are valid subpoenas. Could there ever be a time where there's a subpoena that is only motivated by other concerns? Sure, in theory there could be, but I believe in the vast majority of cases that we should comply and would comply with congressional subpoenas.
I also want to ask about executive orders. You may very well end up working with a Republican-controlled Senate if you are president. How much of your agenda would you be willing to accomplish by executive order if the GOP won't play ball with you?
My hope would be that we can work together to fix our broken immigration system, to improve our healthcare system, and do the things that we need that require congressional action. But I'm willing to take steps, whether it's in our immigration system or on common sense gun safety reforms, to accomplish what we can within the bounds of the Constitution with executive action.
What are some examples of executive orders that you would do?
Well, there are different things. Immediately, I would undo some of the damage that Trump has done on immigration. For instance, we would get rid of that Muslim travel ban. We'd get rid of the Remain in Mexico policy. We would get rid of family separation. On gun control, for instance, I've called for revamping who we treat as a firearms dealer. so that they would have to get a license, somebody that sells more than 5 firearms in a year. And that would also require them to subject people to a background check if they sell a firearm from them. So we're trying to get closer to universal background checks under executive authority. If we're not able to do that with congressional action. Those are the types of things, a couple of the examples that I would use.
We haven't talked about a lot of the issues, and we're coming fairly close to the end of the hour. So I wanted to maybe just get a very brief description of what your main goals would be for reforming the healthcare system.
My main goals would be, number one, to strengthen Medicare and then expand that to every single person who wants Medicare, and to give people two things: a healthcare system where Medicare is the default, so that you automatically will get enrolled in Medicare unless you opt out. People would be able to hold on to a private health insurance plan that is strong, that meets certain benchmarks for coverage, if they want to. I believe that would lead to the vast majority of Americans being on a strong Medicare-based plan.
What about climate change?
Yeah, I put forth a plan to combat climate change that sets a goal of getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2045 and puts a clean energy standard and clean transportation standard in as midterm benchmarks for electricity, the electricity sector, and then also the automotive sector. That includes a carbon fee, and that also includes investing in a Green New Deal. I visited TPI a couple months ago. That I told this story on the debate stage the other day of employing hundreds of people in good paying jobs after the Maytag manufacturing facility closed in Newton.
And that's the wind turbine manufacturer.
Yeah, they manufacture wind turbines. A great example here out of Iowa of putting people to work. And I really see the necessity of combating the climate crisis, not only as a crisis, but as an opportunity. Right? It's a tremendous opportunity to put people to work, to create good jobs. And there's no reason that the United States should not lead that. When I was mayor of San Antonio, I was on the board of the local public utility. We have one of the biggest local public utilities in the country, CPS Energy. And we decided to close one of our coal-fired plants, this Dealey plant, to shutter it, and we invested in a 400 megawatt solar facility. But we also incentivized the investment of hundreds of jobs that went into the manufacturing of solar panels. So we were able to put people to work in good jobs and then also do right by the environment. I mean, I see both of those things as great opportunities for our country.
What would be your criteria for military intervention in another country? Short of them directly attacking us.
Where United States interests are significantly impacted, where our allies' interests are significantly impacted. Now, I believe that we have to set a very, very high bar before we ever engage in military conflict. That we should learn from the lesson, from the mistake of Iraq. I would not be a president who is eager to send our troops abroad to engage in military conflict. I've signed a pledge to end these forever wars out there. We've spent almost $6 trillion on military conflicts since 9/11.
What about getting congressional approval before engaging in military action overseas?
I believe that we should do that Congress should do its job. And so I support Congress authorizing the use of military force. And I don't believe that in some of these conflicts we should be going on an AUMF that was passed 16 years ago, 17 years ago.
What more do you think should be done to decrease the disparity in incarceration rates for racial minorities in this country?
Oh, a number of things. that we should revamp. We should build on the First Step Act that was passed by Congress and signed by the president. You know, I think we should invest in public defenders, because a lot of people who are poor, no matter what color they are, you know, they don't have a fair defense, a good defense. That we should do cash bail reform, sentencing, more sentencing reform. In addition to that, we need to revamp the criminal justice system from the very beginning. You know, the police on the street. I think I've been the most outspoken in this campaign about police reform, because what I see out there is that even though we have a lot of great police officers, and I worked with a lot of them when I was mayor of San Antonio, it's clear that too oftentimes, especially young black men and women, are treated differently, treated with excessive force, stopped more frequently, subjected to the criminal justice system more frequently. We need to reform our police departments, and I've put out a whole plan on a number of ways that we can do that. I also believe that we should do things like legalize marijuana, and that we should invest in diversion programs that try and get people the assistance they need instead of putting them into the criminal justice system in the first place. Because I think too many people get caught up in the criminal justice system that shouldn't, and then that puts a big X on their record and makes it harder for them to ever get their life back on track with a decent job, decent housing, and so forth. You know, I was having this conversation with a group at the University of Utah, gosh, maybe 6 months ago, that they do education classes for people who are incarcerated. And I said, you know, I was saying, well, you know, what we want to do is give people an effective second chance. And somebody said, well, you know, the real problem is that too many people don't get an effective first chance in life. And I think that's true. And so I see all of these things as connected. I see making sure that we have a better education system that doesn't fail so many students, especially these young students of color in poor neighborhoods, to a better healthcare system, to universal child care, to supporting families that, you know, work. I think when you do all of that and also improve policing and improve our criminal justice system, then you're going to get rid of that pipeline that sends too many young people of color into prison.
Policing is thought of as a community responsibility, and so it's community ordinances as well as state laws that govern a lot of that. Here in Iowa, there's not data taken on police stops as far as race, so it makes it sort of difficult to get at that problem. Do you see a federal role in trying to address that?
Oh, absolutely. You know, and we've called for better data collection on all of those counts, and also a national federal database of police officers who've been decertified, because too oftentimes these, you know, officers, now we're talking just about these ones that are, you know, the bad officers that have engaged in some sort of conduct that got them decertified, but too oftentimes somebody will go 20 miles down the road or 200 miles down the road, and they'll be able to get a job at a smaller or different jurisdiction. So there are a number of different ways that we can improve that system. And you know, sometimes when I bring that up, people say, oh, well, are you against the police? And I say, not at all. You know, I'm a lawyer. There are a number of things you can do to improve the legal profession. There are a number of things that you can do to improve the teaching profession or the medical profession. The thing is that what makes policing special, and the job that they do is special, is that people's lives and people's freedom is at stake. And so we need to focus on that.
Right, I want to be respectful of your time here, so I'm going to give you a minute to wrap up and maybe just answer the question, why should we endorse you?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be in front of y'all. Like I said, look, I think I have strong executive experience to be president, that I have a strong, compelling vision for the future of this country, about a kind of country that we can become in the 21st century, that make sure that every family can prosper and where everyone counts. And I believe that that includes Iowa, and making sure that farmers here in Iowa can get back to an administration with stability and certainty. And people here in Des Moines and throughout the state that need to be able to have a decent place to live ensure that their kid can get a good education, that they have health care when they need it. I have strong plans for each of those things, and I have the relevant experience to make sure that they can happen.
All right. Thanks to Secretary Castro, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. Please check out DesMoinesRegister.com for our interviews with all of the presidential candidates and also all the best caucus coverage. Thank you.